All right, I want to welcome those who are maybe joining at some point at the Moorhead Church of Christ Wednesday evening Bible study. We are studying through the Revelation of John. And, you know, since we've been studying this book, as we've been going through it, and, you know, we've sort of recognized what was going on at the time that this book was written, that John had become imprisoned for the sake of the gospel, and that the 7 churches of Asia were encountering great persecution. And the book of Revelation, even though it's filled with imagery and symbols and all kinds of things like that in apocalyptic language, we should never mistake sort of the overall message, and that is that what comes out in Revelation chapter 2 and verse 10 is that we're to be faithful unto death, and we're going to receive a crown of life. That we may encounter fierce persecution in this life at some point in our life, but you know, the message is hang in there. The message is don't let it get in your head and your heart and discourage you from following Jesus, because if you're faithful until death, you're going to get the crown. And those who essentially were the persecutors, they're going to receive really the reward essentially for the wrongdoing that they did. And so just looking at this book and grabbing some of those quick thoughts from it, the idea is it's better to be a Christian than somebody who's not a Christian. Because a Christian is in Christ. A Christian is going to receive all the blessings in Christ. And while there's a great temptation to be in the world and participate in the world's evil deeds, there's no substitute for essentially being in a good spiritual state with Christ Jesus. We're actually going to start in verse 12, but I'd like in chapter 17, verse 12, just to kind of give a light overview, bringing us up to that point. In chapter 17, John sees this vision here. He's told about, in verse 1, about a great harlot that sits on many waters. Obviously, this is something that, you know, this is a very disgusting woman. This is a filthy woman. Verse 3, John is taken in the spirit out in the wilderness. Again, this is a vision. And so out of this, he sees this, and here's this woman who is the great harlot. She is sitting on the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names. And it says, having 7 heads and 10 horns. She is beautifully adorned. She has gold, a gold cup in her hand. She has precious stones, pearls, all these things going on. And then we find out what's said on the woman's forehead, and that is Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth, verse 5. And then verse 6 tells us that, you know, the woman is drunk with the blood of the saints. And obviously this is figurative, she's not literally drinking, but the idea that it's sort of a bloodlust, the idea that she's bloodthirsty, the idea she's taking pleasure in really, you know, putting to death Christians because they're not going to worship the beast, okay? And, you know, John sees all this, and he's trying to figure it all out. John has seen this, so if we have trouble with the book of Revelation, guess what? John is having some trouble understanding this. In verses 8 through 18, which we have to cover through yet in chapter 17, the angel is going to interpret the vision that John saw about the woman sitting on the beast. And we've already talked in verse 8 all about this. We talked about sort of the idea of the Nero myth that was going on, that was popularly believed. You know, the idea that Nero, after his death, said that he'd come back before he died. He's going to come back sometime later, and people believe that. And they really believe that Domitian, since after Nero's death there was no Christian persecution, and Domitian started to persecute Christians once he got in power, that, you know, this was Nero essentially being brought back to life. And so the beast here represents imperial Rome, okay? And we talked about verse 9 there, the idea of the 7 heads, 7 mountains. It really seems to be giving us sort of the landscape on the city in which Rome is built on 7 mountains. Verse 10 is really talking about the Caesars of Rome. Some people believe specifically they mention Caesars from Augustus all the way through Domitian, but every indication is, if it's not specifically, that this is sort of generalized. And also verse 11 there. And so we're going to begin here in verse 12, and John has got to explain some more things. Remember, this is going back to verse 3 in the vision that he saw there about the woman or the harlot on the scarlet beast, full of blasphemous names, having 7 heads, 10 horns. Obviously, this is really language that is really something that we struggle with, because it's just not how we don't recognize this kind of literature. But again, it was very popular even before the book of Revelation. We'll see some of this same kind of writing in the book of Daniel. But the Christians would have really sort of been able to handle a lot of the things that are being said here. Again, remember that the book of Revelation grabs a lot of figures and examples and things from the Old Testament. So when we're trying to understand it, instead of going to premillennialists to essentially really make a mark turn away from really interpreting the Bible with the Bible, we go to the Old Testament. We recognize a lot of these things are brought over. Christians would have been well acquainted with the Old Testament, and so we let the Old Testament help us really interpret. We have the New Testament. So it says, I guess we'll have a reading of this here. We'll let some others read, and then we'll get there. So find some volunteers. Jenna, you look like you're a volunteer. Are you a volunteer?
Yeah.
You want to read 11 through 14, and then we need a 15 through 18. Ryan, you want to do that? Okay.
And the beast which was and is not is himself also an eighth, and is one of the 7, and he goes to destruction. And the 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings, who have not yet received a kingdom, but they received authority as kings with the beast for 1 hour. These have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to the beast. These will wage war against the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings. And those who are with him are the called and chosen and faithful.
And he said to me, the waters which you saw, where the harlot sits, are peoples and multitudes and nations and tongues. And the 10 horns which you saw, and the beast, these will hate the harlot, and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to execute his purpose by having a common purpose, and by giving their kingdom to the beast, until the words of God will be fulfilled. The woman who you saw is the great city, which reigns over the kings of the earth.
Okay. So we're going to make that connection again with verse 18 back to verse 5. And so we think about Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots. It's a great city, and since Babylon, ancient Babylon, has been destroyed, there are some people that are living there, but really the power of Babylon has been destroyed. There's some people that are living there, but that empire has fallen. But Babylon, since they were really in ancient times a foe to God's people, are using symbolically here for the city of Rome.
I might have a silly question, but would Rome technically be occupying Babylon at this time?
I don't know. I don't have the map here, so I guess I really don't know. Maybe somebody else knows. I don't know offhand. But they are. We would assume so, because the idea that when Daniel talks about this the statue there, the Colossus, and he talks about Babylon, and he talks about that'll fall to the Medo-Persians, and then it'll fall to the Greeks, and then to the Romans. We just naturally assume that one swallows up the other one and sort of expands and swallows the other one, expands and swallows.
That's kind of what I was thinking, but I was just...
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I'll try to remember to look at that in particular, but I'm not sure offhand. So Daniel is, the angel is going to explain here to John what these 10 horns are. Okay, so the idea, they're symbolic. Remember that, in the book of Revelation, biblical numerology plays a large part of our understanding. In other words, we've got to be careful about really being too hard and fast with numbers, thinking numbers actually mean the numerical count in which they stand for. In the book of Revelation, they are more symbolic than they are literal. And so I'm going to read a definition here about the number 5 and 10. The numbers 5 and 10, it says, this number came to be a symbol for the perfect or complete human. For instance, a complete man has 5 fingers and toes, or has a total of 10 fingers or 10 toes. 10 seems to be the most complete number. And so the idea here is more of completeness. And so if we sort of think about this in terms of understanding what's going on here, this is not to say that it was sort of literally 10 kings, but sort of the idea is sort of a complete representation of these 10 kings. Many, let's see here, looking at this here, oops, gotta go to the next page, that's why. Tim LaHaye, who is a premillennialist, in his book on Revelation called Illustrated and Made Plain, says that the 10 kings who make up, these are the 10 kings who make up the Antichrist World Confederacy of Nations. So again, when I talk about premillennialists, in other words, really none of these things have happened from Revelation chapter 4, which they believe that the rapture takes place, all the way until the end of the book. They don't believe any of these things have happened. And so they're saying this is going to be down the road sometime later after a rapture, supposed rapture, and then there's going to be this guy during the 7-year tribulation on earth for the people left behind. He's going to be this really wicked leader, and he's going to be the Antichrist, even though he's never mentioned, the Antichrist is never mentioned in the book of Revelation. And so we looked at sort of the numbers and what they mean. Horns also mean something. In other words, they're not to be understood literally, obviously, like the beast is not to be understood literally. But horns, according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, says that it represents complete power. And so the idea of horns is power. The idea that you have 10 horns is the idea of complete power. So the beast, which represents Imperial Rome, has, with these horns, complete power. Okay? And it talks about that they have authority, essentially, that has been given to them. And they essentially have this power, according to verse 12, for 1 hour or a short time. Verse 13 says, these have one purpose, and they give their power and authority to beasts. So if we look at it sort of Imperial Rome, the idea that they essentially are the superpower of their time, we're talking about lesser entities that fall under sort of the reign of the superpower. And we're talking about these 10 kings, and essentially they are in cahoots with Imperial Rome. Okay, Tim LaHaye, again in his book on Revelation, he says, they, the 10 kings, so I'm telling you sort of the premillennial view here, give their power and strength unto the beast. That is, during the last 3.5 years of the tribulation period, they will promise complete allegiance to cooperate with the beast. And so, again, the idea when you think about sort of the premillennial time frame is they're waiting for a rapture, which is stage 1 of the second coming of Christ. All of the saints that are alive and dead are going to be taken up to heaven for 7 years. And during the same time, the people that are left behind on the earth are going to go through the tribulation period. And that's divided by the first 3.5 years, which they're suffering, or maybe somewhat calm, but somewhat suffering. And then things get really bad for those who are on the earth. But looking at it from contextually, I liked what Brother J.W. Roberts in his commentary, The Revelation to John, the Apocalypse, he says, quote, in the course of their conquest and in the consolidation of her empire, Rome had taken many provinces and kingdoms. The usual policy was to allow local leaders, examples the Herods in Palestine, to continue ruling under the watchful eye of the provincial proconsuls. It's talking about like the governors, like Pilate, that we're well acquainted with. Obstinate rulers that were talking about under Rome. Obstinate rulers were, of course, not tolerated. Those who remained and prospered were naturally of one mind and gave over their power and authority to the beast. That is, they supported and carried out the policy. In other words, you're going to get this position, just like Herod had a position during the time of Christ. His power was granted him by Rome, and he has to appease Rome in all of the matters that he handles in order to keep his kingship, because he is a client king. He's in subjection to Rome itself. Okay, any questions between verses 12 and 13 before we get into 14? Okay, so the angel continues. He says, these will wage war. It's talking about those 10 kings against the Lamb. We know that's already been defined or told to us that that's Christ. And the Lamb will overcome them because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are the called and the chosen and the faithful. Again, Tim LaHaye in his commentary on Revelation says, quote, at the end of the tribulation period, the Antichrist with his 10 puppet kings, he's talking about the European Union, will make war against the Lamb and his called, chosen, and faithful followers. And he's talking about the idea of the Battle of Armageddon, and we've talked briefly about that. But the idea that they believe that's a literal war that's going to take place, and when that happens, that's going to spur Christ to come back from heaven with all of the saints to engage in this battle and defeat Satan and his forces according to their theology. But looking at it contextually, the word lamb is applied to Christ, is used overwhelmingly. The word lamb here is used overwhelmingly in the book of Revelation. So when you're reading through the New Testament, you're going to see it used just in a minority of places, but you're going to see it used overwhelmingly here in the book of Revelation. And of course, it's used figuratively of Christ, really in relation to his sacrificial work on the cross to atone for sin. The war here that's spoken about, verse 14, contrary to premillennialists, is not a physical battle. In context, Imperial Rome was at war with Christianity because Christians refused to worship the emperor because it was idolatry. And so, again, if you look at it from Imperial Rome's standpoint, as we've implemented a policy that we believe will keep our empire unified. Remember, they conquered all kinds of different peoples, and they want to maintain unity. And so this is considered a unifying thing by everybody worshiping the emperor, because a lot of these people are polytheistic already. They're worshiping all kinds of other gods. And hey, we're just going to throw one more in there. We're going to essentially have a place in your local community where we'll have a bust of the emperor. At certain periods, you'll be required to grab some incense, put it on an altar before the emperor and say, Caesar is Lord. And then you can go home. And a lot of folks did that. But Christians couldn't because, of course, it's idolatry. Their greatest allegiance was to Christ. So this war is really, this mentioned here, is about against Christians. And ultimately, because it's against Christians, it's also against the Lamb or Christ himself. And there is no way any human force can overpower and conquer the Lamb. And so despite how great the persecution was, despite how many Christians died and the bloodshed and the suffering is the evil force can never overpower and conquer the Lamb. The Lamb is going to be victorious, and all of those who are faithful are with the Lamb are going to be the victors against Imperial Rome. And The angel tells us why, because he is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Now, when we look at this word here, or this phrase, it's similar to what is seen in Deuteronomy 10:17, Daniel chapter 2 and verse 47. We also see it in 1 Timothy 6:15. But the word in Greek here, kurios, translated Lord, is used here in terms of raising Jesus above the human level. In other words, he's above everyone. Okay, the idea that he is Lord over all human lords. Okay, Lord sort of being a master. He is a Lord above all lords. And as a king or a leader of the people, he is a supreme ruler over all kings. In other words, there's no match for him. So even though you have this superpower, Imperial Rome, persecuting Christians and essentially waging war with the Lamb, they're no match for the Lamb, because he is Lord of Lords and King of Kings. And those who are with them are called, the called, the chosen, the faithful. These are going to be the victors. So when we think about those who are called, who are the called? When we think about that.
Who are they called?
Yeah, who are the called?
Wouldn't that be the Christians?
Okay, we're talking about Christians. So in 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 14, we find out that the called really are called through the gospel. Okay, you're called through the gospel, because the idea of the gospel is an invitation from God to have salvation. Now, it may be spoken through human means, but the idea is it's a call for salvation. And so if you respond to the call, then essentially you're part of the call. Not only that, but if you respond to it, you're going to be chosen. And Thayer's Greek English Lexicon talks about this, obtaining salvation through Christ. The idea that now you have salvation because you have obeyed the gospel. And he talks about here about the faithful. And the Greek word here, pistos, means one who has become convinced that Jesus is the Messiah and the author of salvation. If you're convinced of that, the idea that you're faithful to Christ and all of the things that he has to say to the Christian. Revelation 12 verse 11 says, "And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb and because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even to the death." And so the idea that Christians are overcoming their persecutors. Again, Revelation 2:10 says, "Be faithful unto death. I will give you a crown of life." Nobody who is faithful to Christ essentially is going to lose anything. Even though you may lose your life, the idea is you're going to have a crown of life. Your name is going to be written in the book of life. Okay, any questions about 14 until we get in verse 15? Okay? The angel continues. He said to me, that's John, "The waters which you saw where the harlot sits are peoples and multitudes, nations and tongues." That goes back to verse 1. And now he's sort of going to explain to that. So it's interesting when we look at these visions. First of all, the harlot in verse 1 is sitting on many waters. Then when we see in verse 3, when John actually sees her, so the angel says, the great harlot sitting on many waters. Well, in verse 3, when he sees her sitting on a beast. Okay, the idea of these is that this is not actuality. The idea that you're seeing visions here. And we're getting an explanation of what that means about the harlot in verse 1, sitting on the many waters. And he says it's the peoples, multitudes, nations, and tongues. And so these words are very similar in a lot of ways. So the idea of peoples here are, and I'm looking at Greek lexicons here, all those who are of the same stock and language, multitudes. The idea in Revelation 17 verse 15, according to Thayer's Greek English Lexicon, seems to designate troops of men assembled together without order. Nations here has to talk about 4 nations not worshiping the true God. They're pagan or Gentile nations. And tongues, of course, has to do with a language, the idea of a particular people using a distinctive language. Okay, the angel continues in verse 16. It says, "And the 10 horns which you saw and the beast, these will hate the harlot and will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh, and will burn her up with fire. Okay, what do you suppose that's talking about? Based on all the symbols that we've had so far, and we've sort of defined, what do you think's happening in verse 16? Okay. So
it's kind of confusing.
it's kind of confusing, okay? So again, we're looking at the 10 horns are 10 kings. They are subject to the imperial Rome. They're under Rome, okay? And the beast there, of course, is talking about imperial Rome. So the 10 horns, they're the 10 kings, they're under imperial Rome. And these will hate the harlot. Okay, well, the harlot, we learned, is the great city, Babylon, which is really the city of Rome, which is really the point of power from which the whole empire is run. They will hate the harlot, and they will make her desolate and naked, and will eat her flesh and burn up fire. Obviously, these are not the idea that cannibalism, but something major is happening here, okay?
A revolt.
There you go. So the idea is that, there are people that are revolting against Rome, and historically, if you look at, the history of ancient Rome, this is what you have is an empire that's sort of becoming weaker and weaker, and then those who essentially once sort of were aligned with Rome sort of see this as an opportunity to sort of break free. They're disgruntled with Rome. The idea is they don't want Rome telling them what to do. Rome no longer has the power to enforce really their obedience and their loyalty. They essentially are like-minded. The idea is you have some of these kings that are like-minded in these regions, and they're essentially saying, this is our opportunity. We can sort of, work collectively here, and we can sort of rebel against Rome. And that's one of the things that happens with Rome, is the idea seems to just sort of disintegrate, becomes weaker and weaker, especially around the outer regions of the Roman Empire, and it starts sort of just collapsing slowly and surely. And that's what it's talking about, is really, the idea that there's a revolt taking place within Rome. Again, when we look at this, we're seeing all kinds of visions, and we think, well, all of this stuff, how come we don't see this historically? Like all of these things that God is talking about doing there, a lot of this, a lot of the visions are merely visions, but they are visions of judgment written for Christians that are suffering, saying, we're taking this superpower down. And in the end, historically, that's exactly what happens, is the Roman Empire essentially goes away.
John is seeing this vision and writing to Christians in his day.
That's it.
Because Rome was a superpower in his day.
That's it.
But the Bible's continual for saints down the road.
Right.
Do we look at this and put the so-called superpowers or things in our time, or is it just illustration that these types of superpowers just aren't going to last?
Right.
No matter which time that you.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Again, the last thing we want to do with any of the books of the Bible is essentially study it to be historical documents and sort of say, well, that was nice, but how does that apply to me? If we don't essentially make an application. In other words, we know it's inspired. We know that essentially it's given to Christians for a reason, really the encouragement of our faith. So even though Imperial Rome's gone, obviously there is a wealth of material here to Christians, because, we look at our country, this is where we live. We see really continuing hostilities towards Christians. In other words, the morality of the culture is changing. Everybody is supposed to get on board. They're supposed to be accepting, affirming, all that stuff. Okay, well, everybody does get on board. Politicians get on board. The public education system gets on board. A lot of businesses get on board. But, what happens when it comes to Christians? See, if we don't get that, the idea is as Christians have to resist, really the imperial state, if you will, imposing essentially on us sort of the value system we're going to hold to and essentially follow. So for us, we can't essentially say that what the government says is okay, that we should do or practice. And so the application is we should resist, the state, the government, if it tries to in any way, impose on us to change our mind about what God has said and force us, to adhere to their, to their standards. So yeah, I would say if we don't make that application, we're missing out the benefit because, as I mentioned before, there have been ministers in Canada that have been arrested for preaching against homosexuality. The reason why they're arrested is because that was deemed hate speech. See, the government has tricky ways of getting what they want done. In other words, if you say something that isn't supportive of that practice, then you're basically encouraging hate, and you're promoting hate. But when you uphold the teachings of the Bible that homosexuality is sin, you're not essentially being hateful. You're essentially really getting people to see that that's not acceptable to God, and you've got to live the way God wants you to do in order to have the promise of heaven. So yeah, absolutely. I think we have to make that. We could make that application to our own government, any Christian living somewhere else. If they're being persecuted, I've got a big map right outside in the back there of countries that are really going through severe persecution. This would be a great book. Sort of the idea is where can I find encouragement to sort of hold out? Well, one by one, everybody, my neighbors and the people around me are all trying to save their own skin and saying and doing whatever they have to do in order to spare their lives and spare their homes or whatever else. These Christians weren't afraid of losing everything in order to be faithful to Christ, and neither should we be afraid of losing everything, in fact our very lives. So yeah, I think that's absolutely, we should make that connection here in the book of Revelation to our times. So the idea is that Rome is going to be destroyed. It's going to be destroyed by some of those who were once loyal to Rome are going to turn on Rome. If you want to know what the premillennials say, John F. Wolford in his Every Prophecy of the Bible, clear explanations for uncertain times by one of today's premier prophecy scholars. He says what this means is this passage indicates that in the first half of the 7 years, he's talking about the tribulation, this woman representing the world religion will have power, but probably be a continuation of the world church movement, the idea that all these churches are sort of going to surrender truth and sort of come together and support this government. In a present world from which the true church was raptured earlier in a sequence of events, now having come to the midpoint of the 7 years when when the head of the 10 nation takes over the world ruler, the apostate church is no longer useful, and as a matter of fact is in the way, and according to the 10 nations, destroy the woman and terminate the power and position. And so again, the idea they're pushing this way out in the future sometime. I think the problem is that premillennialists, again, want everything to be literal. And so when they don't see all kinds of fire and brimstone and all this stuff that's spoken about in these visions, they're like, well, this can't apply to ancient Rome. But again, they have to make up all kinds of things in order to get this. Instead of having Jesus coming back one time, they've got him coming back twice. And, they've got all kinds of other things they have to do in order to bring this about. But going back to our study of the text here, the great harlot who sat on many waters in her full display of grandeur, ruling over all these peoples in verse 15, eventually experienced them turning on her in the declining years of the Roman Empire. These nations that Rome once had subjugated were able to get out from under complete domination. Little by little, these once subjugated people tore away at the Roman Empire and stripped her of the vast wealth and power and consumed it until it was no longer in existence. Verse 17, the angel continues, he said, for God has put it in their hearts, that's these 10 kings, to execute his purpose by having a common purpose and by giving their kingdom to the beast until the words of God should be fulfilled. So now we've got to really understand what the angel is saying here. And this is similar to things that we're going to see even in the Old Testament. When the nation of Babylon rose up and conquered the southern kingdom of Israel because they were practicing idolatry and they were rebellious to God's word, did God said, to the king of Babylon, listen, I'm ordering you, take all your men and go down there and punish my people. So then, if he didn't do that, then how did the Babylonians go down and destroy, the temple and Jerusalem and take God's people into captivity?
God allowed them to be kind of the superpower, to have that ability to just go in there and, discipline his people.
Okay, so the idea is that God rules the nations, that's what Daniel talks about, that God providentially brought this about. In other words, when you look at ancient nations and you see them in terms of, your kingdom, you have a kingdom, and if you don't do anything and you're the king of that kingdom, the people, your kingdom is going to stay the same size. How do you become a great king and a great people? By being a conqueror. So you go out and you're like, I think we can take those guys down there. We should take them out. Let's get enough troops. We'll have a sneak approach and we'll go in there and I think we can take them. And so then you take them. Okay, now you got that many more people. You have that much more territory. Eventually you're like, hey, I think those guys, we could take them. So we're really talking about expansion, the idea of expansion. And so, the Babylonians had their own reasons for why they attacked Judah. It's probably because, obviously they became weakened. They were not faithful to God. And, they just wanted to expand their kingdom. And so they conquered them. So what we're talking about here is really, the idea of God working providentially through really the jealousies, the ambitions of men for their own reasons to accomplish his will. If we go back and we think about Jesus on the cross, and we think about what led up to that, what was the jealousy of the civil leaders, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the priests and stuff. This essentially led them to taking Jesus before Pilate and getting Pilate to condemn him because they didn't have the power to. So then, of course, Jesus goes to the cross, he dies. What did all these Jewish religious leaders think? Our troubles are all gone. We got rid of this guy. We didn't ever believe he was a Messiah. When Peter preaches that gospel sermon in Acts chapter 2, he's talking about the foreknowledge of God. He's talking about the fact that God knew you guys were going to do this. And essentially, he used your jealousy and your hatred and all those things to pull off the great salvation of man. He didn't tell him to do it. God didn't say, you're going to go and crucify my son. But he used those things from these people's own selfish ambitions to accomplish his will. That's what we have here, right?
And I think it was even talked about in the Old Testament as well. So,
right?
Yeah.
Right, and so God uses other nations, just like you see the Old Testament, to punish his nation. At some point, he uses other nations to punish those nations. This is how God operates. So this is all part of God's plan that this would happen. That essentially this great empire is going to come undone. Verse 18 says, the woman whom you saw is the great city. This goes back to the harlot on the scarlet beast, which reigns over the kings of the earth. Okay, any questions about that? We'll get into chapter 18. Okay, so let's get into 18 and we'll at least kind of get started with that. I need a reader to read the first 3 verses.
I read.
Okay.
And after these things, I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice, saying, Babylon the Great is fallen, and is become the habitation of devils, and the hole of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird. For all nations have drunk of the wine of wrath of her, I got the King James version, of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies.
All right. So now imagine John. I mean, this is in some way, it sort of seems like it would be, information overload. Is John just seeing vision, 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 right? One after another. How far apart was it? Was it all together? It seems like a lot of stuff to take in. Obviously, he's got to have time to write this down. As he's seeing it, to write it down. Why? Not for his own personal self, but this is going to be circulated for the 7 churches of Asia. Beyond that, it's going to go to the churches abroad of the Lord's church. There are other beyond that are suffering persecution. But now we have John. He sees another angel. It comes down from heaven, and he has this great authority. The earth is illuminated. So here, the idea of authority, the Greek lexicon means the idea of power, of course, ability or strength that he has or able to exercise. And John describes the dramatic effect of the angel's presence when he came down from heaven. So again, we have to sort of see this in a vision, the idea he comes down from heaven, so he's in mid-heaven, and his presence, the idea he illuminates really the earth with his glory. What does that mean? The idea that his presence makes the whole earth shine with his glory. And perhaps the idea here is of this angel's greatness and importance of his mission and what he's got to do here. And when we look at what the angel says, now this will be similar to what we've read before in the book of Revelation, verse 2, he says about the angel, he cried out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, and she has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird." And so we want to look at what's being said here, the idea that Babylon is fallen. And by the way, this is used in the Old Testament about the literal Babylon. So when we talk about how much the Old Testament comes to play in the book of Revelation, repeatedly it comes into play. What does it mean, the idea that Babylon has fallen?
I mean, it's no longer an empire.
Okay, so the idea that it's really destroyed, not in the way that we would think of it, but the idea is that, it's no longer going to be in existence. I think, anybody back in that time period, we think about as talking about Imperial Rome, if you just said, do you think, in its heyday, do you think that this great empire will ever be destroyed? What do you suppose the average man or the person would say? Well, no. I mean, that'd be like asking America, say, you think America will ever, we probably might think the same thing. But the idea is that this is unbelievable words. The idea that Babylon, so he is essentially telling John before the time is going to be. So we know Babylon, or the Roman Empire, essentially really goes out of existence by 476 AD. He's telling him essentially, that this great empire is going to be destroyed. Those would be really words that would really shock the mind. And Christians that understood this, of course, would be shocked too to hear that, because really Rome is ruling over everybody. They reign supreme. They're doing whatever they want with Christians, and they're really unstoppable. And the angel announces they're going to be destroyed. The angel's announcements would be incredible, unfathomable for anybody living during the height of the greatness of the Roman Empire. Yet we recognize with God that nothing's impossible with God. It may be impossible with man. The idea is can we amass enough troops to go in there and fight? No. And so even though the demise of the Roman Empire is really without a sort of a bang, the idea is God brings about the impossible. And really, the whole empire just sort of becomes unraveled over the course of time. The once mighty essentially becomes powerless. And it is God who rules the nations that it really brings this about. So Babylon is numbered. Now I want to take you back to Daniel 2:44. And I want to read this again after talking about that Colossus, that statue, and talking about these empires that are going to be there in the time. First of all, Babylon, and then the Medo-Persians, and then the Greeks, and then the Romans. The Romans are the last ones talked about in terms of the legs and the feet. It says in Daniel 2:4, it said, and in the days of those kings, we're talking about the Roman Empire, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which will never be destroyed. Well, which kingdom is that?
The church.
This is the church. Okay, remember Jesus uses the word church and kingdom interchangeably in Matthew 16, 18, 19. And that kingdom will not be left for another people. It will crush and put an end to all these kingdoms, but it will itself endure forever. And so the idea of the kingdom of Christ continues to exist. And it's not the same kind of kingdom in the sense that the previous kingdoms were. Those were physical kingdoms. The kingdom of Christ, of course, is a spiritual kingdom. So what does it mean when we look at that last the line of the verse there in verse 1 there? It says, or verse 2, it says, and she has become a dwelling place. Now that would be Babylon, or the great city of Rome, with her imperial power. And she has become a dwelling place of demons and a prison of every unclean spirit and a prison of every unclean and hateful bird. And just a little bit about here, the idea that demons, of course this comes from Luke chapter 8 verse 29, live in deserted places. And so the idea is it's a ruined city, and the hateful birds, as New American Standard talks about, is the word here is especially in a moral sense, the idea of unclean, impure, of evil spirits. So the translation is kind of rough there in terms of the idea is this is going to be a place when great Rome is done, it's going to be a place that is going to be ruined. Okay, we know Rome still exists today, but when we look at the Rome of today, and we look at the Rome of in the height of its imperial power, well, it's more of a tourist place versus any kind of power that can do anything. And so it's really just talking about sort of the idea of it's going to be desolate. And again, this is a vision, so we shouldn't try to force this to be literal here. Wayne Jackson, in his commentary on Revelation called Jesus Christ's Final Message of Hope, Select Studies from the Apocalypse, says, quote, and just as ancient Babylon was destroyed by God because of her wickedness and so became a dwelling place of wild creatures, this anti-God Babylon, a political religious amalgamation, shall be similarly a victim of divine wrath. Okay? We're going to do verse 3 because that's a break here in the text, so we'll try to get this done real quick. Verse 3 says, for all the nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. Okay, what we're looking at here is the tremendous influence that Imperial Rome had on all of those that were in the empire, all of those, the client kings, all of those essentially within its influence, essentially had a tremendous influence of evil. And it gives us really here three reasons Babylon will be destroyed here. Number one, it says, for all the angels have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality. So the nations, again, remember, those are nations not worshiping the true God. It's talking about pagan or Gentile nations. And the figurative, the wine here is used figuratively in the sense that Imperial Rome exported to other nations under their power essentially was laced with toxic evil. In other words, their interaction, because they were immoral, because they were wicked, they were really spreading their wickedness on all of those who are under their power. The word drunk here, according to the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, says that the wine is a picture of active wrath. In other words, they're giving, they're involved with all this wickedness and evil, and by essentially exporting it throughout their empire, they are essentially causing others to essentially be guilty of sin against God. Okay? The word passion here, a New American Standard, the Greek word is thumos, and the Theological Diction of the New Testament says the wrath of God is objectified as wine. In Revelation 14:8 and 18:3, the wine of the wrath of fornication which Babylon has made the nations drink is the godlessness with which it has ensnared the nations, so that they have fallen into sin and under the wrath of God. A lot of times I think of sort of America and our influence. We think America is great. We think of the influence. The idea is that we essentially export our evil as well, whether it's pornography as a nation, or when we're giving other countries money, assistance, the third world countries, we're essentially saying, listen, you got to promote LGBT causes in order to get the money. If you don't do that, then we're not going to give you money that you can use for your nation. And so we export a great deal of our own evil as a nation, and it's sad to say, but this is what's going on here with ancient Rome, and they have made others really fall under the same condemnation of themselves. The immorality here, of course, the Greek word is porneia, and it means prostitution, unchastity, fornication of every kind of unlawful sexual intercourse. But here, when we're used here, it's not really talking about in the literal sense, but in the figurative sense. And it's really talking about as an Old Testament symbol of apostasy from God. And so we have nations that are fallen in line with the immorality of Rome. And then we have here the kings of the earth have committed acts of immorality with her. And it's really talked about the idea of being spiritually infected by the great Roman Empire. The idea that they're all sort of being negatively affected spiritually. In other words, the wrath that's going to come from God is going to affect them all, and even down to the merchants. The third one, the merchants of the earth have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality, and of course the idea is they're making a lot because Imperial Rome is so great and so many people are coming to them and they have this power. The idea is these merchants are making money, as we would say, hand over fist. But you know what? They also are going to be entrapped in terms of the wrath of God because of the immorality that has come even to them. They're in Rome and they're part of Rome, and so they're going to incur the same wrath. Now I raced through this. Is there any questions about these first three verses, Jenna?
At the end of verse 2, when it talks about demons, could
Yep.
it be talking about bad people who still resided in Rome?
Well, it's talking about demons. When I looked at the Greek word, it's really talking about sort of in the literal sense. And if you sort of think about it from the time period, that still would have been the time period where demon possession took place. The Apostle John had, as well as the apostles, had the ability to cast out demons. The idea that the demons, just as the demons are around today, they were there. Obviously, there's no demon possession today and all that. But you think about, there's one devil. He's not omnipresent. So he has to have a lot of helpers in order to tempt us to sin. And so, the demons would very much be a part of that activity. But it really seems to be going back to what was said in Luke, the idea that there's a comment made about the idea that demons reside in these uninhabited places. That's what it says. So that's kind of what I've got to say, and I've got to leave it there because I just don't know what else to say other than that's what it says. And the idea, the whole thing is the idea is there's going to be a place that is going to be, uninhabited. It's really what is bringing it out here. So I want to thank those who have joined us for tonight's class. Lord willing, a week from now, we'll have another class about this great book, the book of Revelation. God bless you.